Hello, my friends, and welcome to episode 158 of Stand Up. Joining me today, author and journalist Yates Sexton is back because he was such a big hit the first time. And David Litt, also a big hit the first time he was on the podcast. He is a former Obama speechwriter, best-selling author, and lots to talk about with both these guys. It's time to stand up with me right now. Hey guys, how you doing? How was your Monday? And I hope you are going to have a good Tuesday if you're listening chronologically in order. I do the podcast every day, so I just assume you're listening to each episode, although I know only a handful of you do that. People are often binging it on long trips and listening to a bunch of episodes at once. Got a shout out from Therese, who took a vacation that she is well-deserved, got up to the Cape, and I woke up to a really nice message from you, young lady, talking about all of the episodes that you caught up on and how much you enjoy them. That was a really nice email to wake up to. I love waking up to nice messages on Patreon or in an email, and Therese wrote to me this morning, said, "So I'm almost caught up. I had to take a break from all things newsy political for about a week. Good for you, T. Taffy is what people will call her. She said it's just all too much, and I thought I might take a break altogether. Today, on our way home from the Cape, I listened to a couple of last week's shows. Naturally, they were stellar. I'm always blown away by the guests you have on and the ease with which you're able to draw them out. It always feels like I'm eavesdropping on an intimate conversation, and they all come off as effortless. Really fucking great job, Pete. I was sad to hear you're going through some personal difficulties. Please reach out if I can help in any way. Seriously, I hope you know that I mean it." I know that you mean it, and I love you, and I love all of you. Been so supportive, and I'm trying to be just as supportive to you, getting back to your messages and responding to your requests. You're all producers of the show, especially if you are a member of our stand-up community. You've got a paid subscription at patreon.com/Pete Dominick, or just go to the show notes and click on the paid subscription link, and you can be a part of this community. A Thursday night, we're going to get together, 8 p.m. Eastern, everybody, 8 p.m. Eastern, Thursday night. I'm inviting you all to a Zoom hangout. You got to be a subscriber for $5 or less a month. You can join us, and these are pretty inspiring hangouts. We often get great regular guests of the podcast. Who would you like to join us on Thursday night? I asked Yates Sexton to be my guest during our interview, so maybe I'll get him to come by. Who else would you like to stop by on Thursday? Saturday night, I'll be in Pennsylvania doing stand-up comedy. What the hell's that all about? Outdoor stand-up comedy. I think I'll wear shorts. See my chicken legs, my hairless calves. I'll joke about that. That's a good idea. I don't have hair in my calves. Anyway, sorry I gave you that image. Lots to talk about before we get to the guests in terms of headlines. President Trump has been in office for 1,292 days, 1,292 days. Our long national nightmare, 90 days until Election Day. And I have great conversations about the election and the dangers that we are facing in terms of the compromises and the rigged election. It's not what President Trump calls a rigged election. I like the WTF happened today, and I love Matt's work there. You should definitely subscribe to that daily newsletter. He has this thing he starts with, today in one sentence. Monday, August 2nd, he says, Dr. Deborah Birx warned that the country is in a new phase of the coronavirus pandemic and that the current outbreak is extraordinarily widespread. And Trump tweeted that Dr. Birx's performance has been pathetic. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office suggested that it's investigating Trump and his company for bank and insurance fraud, and Trump threatened legal action after Nevada's legislature passed a bill to automatically send mail-in ballots to all active voters. Whew! Good one. Good one sentence to describe our Monday of this week. By the way, I thought the sun and warm weather was going to beat the virus back. I mean, I was hoping for that. I really wanted that to be the case, but in July, the U.S. recorded more than 1.9 million new coronavirus infections in July. Nearly 42% of the more than 4.5 million cases reported since the pandemic began, and more than double the number documented in any other month That's according to the New York Times. Hoo-wee! July was oh, bad. Very bad. Now it's time to go back to school. We still have August, though, right? We still have like 3 weeks left of August. Please. Oh. The Trump campaign sent out an email encouraging mask wearing to his supporters. There's been some confusion surrounding the usage of face masks. And, of course, that's being panned and criticized and made fun of because where the hell have that directive been for the last 4 months? A little bit late there. Yeah, a little late. He's still not wearing a mask anywhere he goes. We got to see his full fucking awful dog face. Ugly motherfucker. Schools reopening. And my friend Nick up in Maine was on a Zoom chat last night with like 20 other parents trying to figure out what the hell to do. I think that's a good idea, getting together with other parents, especially in small communities where you can make even more of a difference. 4 in 5 families in America are considering homeschooling. Is that right? Teachers protesting across the nation. It's a mess, the back-to-school situation. We can't do it. I just don't think we can do it. I don't know. I mean, even in the areas like where I live, where we beat the virus back pretty well, it's risky putting those kids in a classroom like that. They give it to the teachers. The teachers got to go into work paranoid every day. The whole situation is not going to be great. Although I do like the idea of small class sizes. We'll see how much you can get done in just a couple, 2 or 3 days of school in small class sizes. Do you learn more? I bet you do. This story from the out of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office is interesting. Seems they may be investigating Trump and his company for bank and insurance fraud. Nick DeFabrizio, longtime listener, subscriber, caller of the old show, and director of the Shedio Project, was at my house tonight putting drywall, sheetrock, what do you call it? Wallboard, the green kind, the moisture protective kind, on the ceiling of the Shedio, or the DFAB. I'm going to name it after Nick because he's put so much work in it. 63-year-old guy climbing up and down ladders, carrying shit. Put like 15 pieces of sheetrock in his pickup truck alone. Got it out of the store, brought it out to his truck, put it in. Of course, I helped him unload it, and Ava helped me. Anyway, going off on a tangent here. Are you still listening to the opening? Who are you? Who's still listening? I've got things to say. I've got important things to say still. He was talking about this story with me while we were putting the wallboard on the ceiling. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office is suggesting that it's investigating Trump and his company for bank and insurance fraud. Until now, Cyrus Vance, who I smoked a cigar with in Aspen at some billionaire's house. I'm not going to lie to you. I'll tell you about that sometime. Next Zoom chat, if anybody wants to know about that. It was a fun night. John Meacham was there. Anyway, Cyrus Vance's inquiry had appeared focused on hush money payments made on a run-up to 2016 presidential election to 2 women who said they had affairs with Trump. But in a court filing, the Manhattan District Attorney Cy Vance, who I smoked cigars with in Aspen, said Trump's arguments that a subpoena for 8 years of his personal and corporate tax records was too broad stem from the, quote, the false premise. The probe was limited to hush money payments. Cyrus Vance told the judge that he was justified in demanding the financial records, citing public reports of extensive and protracted criminal conduct at the Trump organization. The filing doesn't say specifically what the Manhattan District Attorney is investigating, but instead quotes from an October opinion by a district judge in New York who listed a number of publicly reported investigations that included allegations of, quote, insurance and bank fraud by the Trump organization. So that is where all the speculation is leading to what the Manhattan District Attorney's investigating. Law and Order sound. Boom, boom. Sorry. I'm not going to go spend 15 minutes trying to find that goddamn sound, record it, and then throw it into the show. I should put it on my pad to have it there at all times. Probably copyrighted anyway. And finally, before I get to my first guest, Jared Yates Sexton, I wanted to read, and I know I've been yapping away here and talking a lot. Is this thing even recording? Yeah, it still is. Almost 10 minutes in. Okay, I'm wrapping it up by reading something from Ed Young in the Atlantic magazine. Dr. Aaron Carroll tweeted this, shared this excerpt, and said, always, always read Ed Young. This is the title of the piece, a long piece, and it's a very important piece, and everybody should read it and subscribe to this fantastic magazine. The Atlantic. Titled How the Pandemic Defeated America. Virus has brought the world's most powerful country to its knees. Let me just read a little bit of this very long, important piece by the great Ed Yong. He writes, no one should be shocked that a liar who has made almost 20,000 false or misleading claims during his presidency would lie about whether the U.S. had the pandemic under control, that a racist who gave birth to birtherism would do little to stop a virus that was disproportionately killing black people, that a xenophobe who presided over the creation of new immigration detention centers would order meatpacking plants with a substantial immigrant workforce to remain open, that a cruel man devoid of empathy would fail to calm fearful citizens, that a narcissist who cannot stand to be upstaged would refuse to tap the deep well of experts at his disposal, that a scion of nepotism would hand control of a shadow coronavirus task force to his unqualified son-in-law, that an armchair polymath would claim to have a, quote, natural ability at medicine and display it by wondering out loud about the curative potential of injecting disinfectant, that an egoist incapable of admitting failure would try to distract from his greatest one by blaming China, defunding the WHO, and promoting miracle drugs, or that a president who has been shielded by his party from any shred of accountability would say when asked about the lack of testing, quote, I don't take any responsibility at all. That is Ed Yong, just one fiery passage in his great article at The Atlantic, How the Pandemic Defeated America. A virus has brought the world's most powerful country to its knees. I highly recommend that. At tip to Aaron Carroll for sharing that on Twitter. I retweeted it as well, at Pete Dominick. Okay. So, I'll see you Thursday night at 8 p.m. at the Hangout. You got to be a Patreon subscriber to get that link. And I will see you Saturday night in Pennsylvania. Check my social media to get tickets. Royersford, Pennsylvania. Now, batten down the hatches because we're getting licked by a hurricane on the East Coast. It's going to be a rough night here, I think, in Rockland County, New York. Hurricane Isaiah State. Stop naming hurricanes more than 2 syllables. This is preposterous. 60 miles east of Charleston, South Carolina, as I record this at 11:16 p.m. on Monday, August 3rd. Is that what today is? Anyway, thank you for tuning in. Hope you liked the top of today's show. And now to my conversation with Jared Yates Sexton. He is the author of American Rule, which is such a really, really good book. I highly recommend it. One of my favorite people to listen to right now, and I'm really excited to have him back on the podcast today. He tweets at JY Sexton. He's got his own podcast and Patreon as well. It's called The Muckrake. I listen to it. It's real good. He's real good. Here's our conversation. Jared Yates Sexton. I posted our first podcast, and in the show notes, I wrote Jared Lee Sexton. And I don't know why I did that. I don't know why I changed you from a presidential assassin sounding name to a more rednecky name. Maybe that's pejorative, but that's what I did. And
it sounds like my back road cousin, the guy who would come to me and give me like some, carburetor gin is what it sounds like.
Is that any good, by the way? Asking for a friend.
Make you go blind immediately.
Right? But it'll run your car for a while.
The great thing in my family is you hear stuff like that.
Yeah.
Where it's like they'll be like, oh yeah, somebody made this in their car, and it's like, is it any good? It's like it's only blind to like 5 people at this point. So you're like, oh, quality.
What town? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in southern Indiana. So I grew up in like real sticks type of place.
What did you do for fun?
I was talking about this the other day. So we did a lot of, driving out in the woods and drinking in a field. And then if we weren't doing that, we would basically drive around the main strip in town and just wave at each other as we drove by. I mean, like really sophisticated, cosmopolitan type shit.
I am so happy to have you back on the podcast. The reaction to your first appearance was awesome. And I almost feel weird saying this because I don't want to alienate or ignore other guests, but I've been listening to your podcast that you do with Nick Hausman, and you guys have just launched a Patreon. And I listen to the Muckrake podcast now every week, and I can't wait for the next one. There's very few people I could just listen to talk or read their tweets. You're just that guy. And on your podcast, your co-host is also a real smart guy, but he sets you up to get going and ranting. And I was just sitting there listening to your every word while you were in the car driving last week for your podcast. And I was out like weed whacking or doing some lawn shit while you were scaring the wits out of me with your accurate analysis.
It was a weird week last week.
The last 2 weeks, I agree. How can we agree? Why do we agree on that? Why?
Yeah, the weird thing about this pandemic thing, and I don't know how you feel about it. I've been talking with a lot of people. It feels like it goes in waves. Like there are these moments during the pandemic where not only are you isolated and kind of going through like national and, civilizational trauma, but there are moments where it feels like, oh, maybe a cloud moved and maybe some sunlight broke through and maybe there's a treatment coming or, all of a sudden it's like, no, I think we can come together and fix this thing. I think in the past couple of weeks, what we've seen is a lot of terror and desperation, particularly from the right. It is obvious that not only did they screw up the pandemic response, but I think they're desperate to try and keep hold of power in the re-election. And so obviously we saw Trump starting to float the idea of delaying an election, which, we can argue about whether or not he can do it, but the fact that he spoke it into existence, I think should just terrify the hell out of everybody. Bill Barr's testimony was, I mean, that's enough to make your hair curl up. I mean, it was terrible to see what he's capable of and what he's interested in doing and what he's able to sort of communicate for that administration. And we find out, of course, that Jared Kushner had a plan for nationwide testing. It was scrapped because they thought it would be good for people in blue states to die.
Yeah.
Which, I don't know where you're from. That's genocide.
Yeah, I don't think that's too far to say, or it's ignoring, as another guest said to me, David Litt said this to me, if North Korea was going to strike American cities with nuclear missiles, it's like, well, let the ones that are going to hit San Francisco and other liberal, bastions of voters. It's looking the other way, in effect. And if that reporting is accurate about Jared Kushner looking the other way, I mean, no one would be surprised because that guy's a craven maniac. But that is just, you say genocide. I don't know. I can't make it any more serious than that, I guess.
Yeah, and the terrible thing about it is it has been collaborated at this point by multiple sources, multiple organizations. Like, this is what happened. They got to the brink of actually having a testing strategy, which we all know now would have saved God knows how many thousands of lives. Right. And not just and that's the other problem is when we talk about COVID, we make the mistake of only talking about the people who have died. I mean, this is maiming people. This is like reducing lifespan. This is creating permanent damage. And on top of that, it's wrecked the economy. We were just talking on the Muckrake podcast with a higher education specialist. Higher education is on the brink of collapse because of something like this. Like, we're looking at like a systemic collapse all across. They had a possibility of staving off some of the worst effects of this thing. And they decided, no, it'll be great for re-election if we let places like California and New York burn. And of course, you can't let those states burn because this is one of the most highly contagious diseases we've ever seen. And now it's in the red states as well, which they keep referring to as our people. And when you really look at it, it's terrible.
I hadn't noticed that. Who's referring to as our people? Who's saying that? Jesus.
The Trump administration in briefings.
Okay. You said something, I don't know if it was on Twitter. I get confused if I was listening to you. I've become such a big sycophant of Jared that I'm not sure where I heard it, but I wrote it down and I was going to use it on TV the other night when I was on TV, and I was almost like, and be like, you know what? I was on MSNBC Saturday night, and I was going to tell the booker, I'm like, they should just have Jared Sexton because I'm going to use a lot of his stuff anyway.
I thought you killed on there. No, not to blow it back, but I thought you killed on there.
Well, I appreciate that. It's probably because I used your talking points, your points, and but you said this idea of the myth of American exceptionalism has done tremendous damage, and I thought that was so important to unpack. Of course, you touch on that in your book. But I'd love to just talk a little bit about what you meant by that and why it's so important. As you look around the rest of the world as they're reacting to the pandemic, nobody really knows exactly what to do perfectly, but everybody is trying at least to acknowledge it almost everywhere. So how is the myth of American exceptionalism put us in this situation in your mind?
So to give people a little bit of background, I didn't totally understand it. I've heard those words sort of thrown around, and I always thought it was the idea that America just happened to stand like, heads and shoulders above other countries, the idea of patriotism or nationalism. But, I started doing research on American rule, and what I found was that America has crafted this incredible propaganda myth, which is like a national religion, and the idea that America has been chosen by a god to be sort of his champion. Right? Like we, and this goes back for, centuries, all of modern history. We believe that we are the inheritors of the legacy of the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, that we just happen to be the main focus of the universe. And as a result, we always have a cosmic will on our side, which means we're going to win every war. We're going to be incredibly rich and powerful, and the world will just work the way that we want. The problem is that it makes us expect things to work, right? So like I don't know, let's just use, a pandemic. Why would it ravage us? Why would we fail so terribly during a pandemic? Because we're obviously chosen by, a divine figure that will chart our course for us.
Right.
And what ends up happening is there's always a myth that goes along with this, because the idea of this nationalistic religious myth, it can't be the universe. It can't be our own failings. It has to be a conspiracy. It has to be someone from the inside turning against us. It has to be like a devilish conspiracy against us. And that's one of the reasons why we see so many of these conspiracy theories based around not just the pandemic, but the last couple of decades of American existence. That's why you keep hearing that there's like these grand conspiracies like the New World Order and the Deep State and QAnon and all of that. It's based on this excuse for why, if we are the chosen country, are we failing so terribly? And unfortunately, it's led to civil liberties being destroyed. It's led to electoral discrimination, and now it's led to hundreds of thousands of people dying needlessly in a pandemic.
But it's so much propaganda. It's so much storytelling. I mean, you're a sports fan, and maybe you can use an analogy here. But if you win 50 games in a row on your 51st game, you don't have to think about it as much. But if you just think that it's going to happen, then you don't play as hard and you might lose. And we've seen that happen in sports a lot of times. But in our case, well, we were doing pretty good. Certainly white folks were doing better and better. And we won, the wars, the great wars and World War II. But then we started losing wars, and then we started losing a lot of things, rights that we had gained. And a lot of people have been losing for a really, really long time by so many metrics. But it doesn't look that way. And I think media does a terrible job at portraying the health of the economy by looking at the worst indicators, which in effect, if you looked at more accurate indicators, you would see a lot of people have been suffering, if not been stagnating. So what's the sports metaphor, and how do you, compare that to what we see in American life in 2020?
Well, I mean, let's just start off with the idea. I'm a baseball fan, and right now we're watching Major League Baseball possibly being canceled for the rest of the season because they can't control the pandemic even within like a bubble of millionaires. It's the idea that there are like baseball gods, right? The next pitch, the next hit, whatever happens next, it's the determination of some sort of supernatural thing. It has nothing to do with human effort. And you're exactly right about the resting on the laurels, because what happened with America is particularly, let's go ahead, because we could go back to the very beginning, but let's go back to World War II, correct? The mythology of America that we have is that America, again, is this champion of justice and liberty and equality and freedom. And we fought the fascists in World War II, right? And we beat them, which makes us the hero. Well, guess what?
And it also makes us anti-fascist.
It also makes us Antifa, but that's a different thing altogether. The problem is that also flattens out history, because the Third Reich and even Benito Mussolini's Italy were widely inspired by American ideas, American citizens. They actually looked at things like the genocide of the Native Americans. They looked at the Confederacy. They looked at Jim Crow South, and they were like, That's great. I love that America did that. And in fact, Hitler wanted to work with America to form a white union against people of color. But we don't like to talk about that.
And there are a lot of Americans that want to work with him. I learned by listening to your podcast. I think there was like, a convention with 30,000 Nazis in Madison Square Garden or something like that.
Madison Square Garden, which, by the way, a picture of George Washington and the American flag right next to swastikas. That happened. So when you actually start looking at what happened coming out of World War II, we think that we're invincible. And we think that everything that we do has the will of God, right? Because look at us, we're on a winning streak. We won a couple of games, and all of a sudden, what do? Now we start poking around in matters all around the world. We start toppling governments because, by the way, we're facing the Soviet Union, and they're evil, right? They're the devil that we have to take on. And again, it's good versus evil. And so we're going in, we're knocking over democratically elected leaders. We're putting in dictators who just happen to serve our interest. Then all of a sudden, we get to Vietnam. And let's take a quick look at Vietnam. Vietnam was inspired by us. Like Ho Chi Minh, wanted to be another American revolution. He even took the Declaration of Independence and used it for the Declaration of Independence for Vietnam. Well, we go in and we're like, no, you're not going to have your revolution, even if it's inspired by us. We go into Vietnam, we lose. There's no way we can win that. But what ends up happening? The 1980s, Ronald Reagan comes along and he creates this revival moment. And I don't know if you've ever listened to some of these old speeches with Ronald Reagan, but he starts creating this mythology that we lost Vietnam because of traitors, right? It's always a traitor. It's a knife in the back mythology. And we start believing the problem is we had a bunch of liberals who didn't want to go all the way, right? They didn't really.
If only they would have let us fight without all the rules they put on us. We heard that during the Vietnam War era, and a lot of historians kind of rewriting that. We heard it. We even hear it now from people talking about Afghanistan and Iraq. If only they would have let us slaughter more people, we would have won the war.
Yeah, and if you want to go in, and I was getting ready to get into Iraq and Afghanistan, if you want to understand this idea, you have to look into a guy named Leo Strauss. And Leo Strauss is a political philosopher, and he is he's the originator of what we now call neoconservatism. He's the person who inspired people like Francis Fukuyama. He inspired, of course, Dick Cheney and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld and, Kristol and all of these people who wanted to go to war in Iraq. And the idea behind Straussian politics is that you can achieve anything as long as you create a crusade. You create a story of good versus evil, which is, again, going back to this idea of American exceptionalism. So all of a sudden, we go into Afghanistan and we just expect to win because we're America. We go into Iraq and we just expect them to greet us as liberators in the street. And unfortunately, what we've seen with the Forever War is a mortal wound that is now crippling the American empire. And all of, our so-called chickens are coming home to roost because the hubris that we displayed really knocked us off a possible new future. We could have, in a post-September 11th world, created a new order where we led. I mean, the entire world was ready to join us.
That's right. That's right. And now, as you bring it full circle with the pandemic, when we first saw this outbreak in China and in Europe, there were a certain segment of Americans that weren't that concerned about it. They weren't epidemiologists ringing the bell. But of course, the federal government was in denial, still is, you could argue, slow to act. And then when you did see it ravage, as we mentioned earlier, certain communities, they were black and brown communities overwhelmingly. They were in, as we said, the blue states. Now you're seeing it in the South. You're seeing it in the red states. And it's kind of what you've been talking about here, this myth of American exceptionalism, in that it's not going to get me. It's not going to affect me and mine. And that's why, by the way, I don't have to wear a mask and follow these stupid rules. That is betraying people's lives and families right now. And some of them are going to their graves still thinking it was a hoax. It is a hoax.
Well, and part of the entire idea that we're talking about, unfortunately, is this idea of messianic philosophy, right? Like you and I are the heroes of our story. And as a result, because we're Americans, and by the way, we're a couple of white dudes, right? So that makes us more inclined to believe that we are the heroes of history because white supremacy is part of this entire idea of American exceptionalism. So suddenly we're the heroes of history. How could we ever be struck down at a young age by a pandemic? This is for other people to worry about, right? It's for people who have done something wrong. And a lot of these people, and I keep talking about the cult of the shining city, you might have seen these things where it was like back in Easter, they would find people coming out of church and they'd be like, aren't you afraid? And they're like, no, I'm washed in the blood of Jesus.
Yeah. Oh, God.
And all of a sudden it's like, I'm a white person who is a Christian in America. How could I possibly ever be struck down by this pandemic? But the problem is propaganda, philosophy, ideology, it doesn't exist at the molecular level. This stuff has, you can't, fake news does not go down to the level of contagion. And so like you are in a situation now where America is having to face up to the point that not only are we not exceptional, but we've actually been failing for a long time.
It's really interesting the way that you say that because I've been arguing for a long time, and not that they're any of my original arguments, but the experts that I read and listen to, talking about policy. Mostly what I've been talking about over the years is policy with experts who understand policy and what works and what doesn't. It's hard to prove a negative. It's hard to prove that a policy is why someone succeeds or fails in life, a government policy or any other policy at your job. But I think that there's been so much ignorance. Let's just talk about economic policy, around economic policy and, quote, conservative solutions for it, like trickle-down in economics. It's been so debunked, but it's a very hard thing to convince people that the reason their wages have stagnated, the reason why they don't have health care, the reason why they don't have other advantages in life is because of this policy or that policy. However, what you just said is like checkmate. It's this is the reason you're dying. You got the virus. There's, like you said, down to the molecular level. But these economic policies, these conservative principles and ideas have been zombies that will not die, and they have destroyed generations, a couple, maybe 3 generations of Americans, I would argue.
Well, and let's take that for a second. I want to take everyone back into the 1990s. And this is one of those turning points.
Oh, the greatest decade ever if you were a white kid in the suburbs, at least.
That's right. Or if you were a corporate leader who was really excited about going global. And so if you take a look in the 1990s, particularly during the idea of healthcare, right? Like when all of a sudden the Clinton administration is like, we're going to take a real shot at healthcare reform. And let's go back to this time. And by the way, in the middle of a pandemic, it's becoming very obvious, like not only how antiquated our healthcare system is, but how it's leading to people dying, right? It is completely not up to snuff. And we haven't taken it seriously in this country for decades, if not generations. Go back to that time. And what you actually had with Bill Clinton and the administration is you had a very center-right administration that wanted to roll out conservative healthcare reform. It wasn't a massive government takeover. It wasn't some sort of liberal plan to, get their hands in this whole thing. In fact, it was like a Republican designed plan. So let's go back into the 1990s and take a look at that healthcare moment. The Republicans had no options, because Bill Clinton was giving them their healthcare option. He said, you win. Let's go with what you wanted to do. And all of a sudden, these Republican think tanks started rolling out, particularly with somebody like William Kristol. He rolls out this memo that says, if we allow him this win, we might never win the presidency again, right? Because he's taking over conservatism. So what does the Republican Party start doing? They start peddling conspiracy theories. Well, there's no problem with our healthcare. Why would Bill Clinton say that there is? Oh, he's a socialist trying to take over the country, right? He's coming for you. He's coming for your family. He's a New World Order stooge. The UN's going to show up on your block. One world government. We're done, right? And by the way, that made the Republican Party a lot of money. That also led to the Gingrich Revolution. And it also led to the NRA that we currently know and the gun state that we currently live in. So what ends up happening is the conspiracy theory, which is based on American exceptionalism, the idea that when we fail, it's because there are traitors in our midst and there are conspiracies against us. It all works together to make our type of life worse. It hinders human progress. It hinders a better kind of life. And it's all based on, yeah, you could do better, but you need to protect what you have now, even though what you have now isn't much. And so it's all based on fear, and it's all based on that white supremacist paranoia.
So true. I mean, there's so many other points during that time period that we could probably talk about too, including, I feel like the downfall of organized labor, of labor unions, is a very, very important point as well. You look around the world that, where they still have a lot of strength. And obviously there's been a ton of historical corruption. I'm watching that Netflix thing on the mafia within unions, there's no doubt about it. They're not perfect. But I guess we're talking about the corruption of organized labor versus the corruption of private companies and in government and the way that, campaigns are funded and so on. But what about that? What about the fact that we just, so many different organizations just don't have the ability to collectively bargain, and it's been so deteriorated and destroyed. There's been nothing but success for conservatives on that, it would seem.
Well, I mean, it's all based upon socialist scaremonger. I mean, if you actually look at, let's say the 20th century in America, one time after another, every time that you have solidarity or you have unions and they start making actual strides, all of a sudden the rumors start going out that, oh, Russia's behind it. Right? Russia has its hand in this, or communists have their hand in it. You actually go back into these riots in 1919. It was the first Red Scare. And all of a sudden you have unions being wiped out left and right because of fear of communism. And then all of a sudden that happens again post World War II. That also happens with every civil liberties movement that we have. Oh, why are people saying something's wrong with America? Why don't they think it's the greatest country in the world? They must be conspirators and liars and traitors. So what continually happens is that people keep getting told again about American exceptionalism. If we are godly and we are the chosen country, who are the people who are coming after us? And right. You actually, I don't know if you saw it, but it was Crenshaw the other day. He was talking about Antifa.
Congressman
right?
Dan Crenshaw. Yeah.
Dan Crenshaw was out the other day, and he was talking about Antifa being a terrorist organization. He's on Fox News, and he goes, oh, Antifa, they're fascist, they're communist, they're socialist. And I don't know how much attention people pay to history, but fascist and socialist and communist are not hanging out in the same group. They're natural enemies, right? So basically, it was a choose your own adventure. Whatever scares you, whatever keeps you awake at night and keeps you voting for a party that isn't going to take care of you at all, choose that. Because that's who your enemy is. And that is always what hinders progress, are these conspiracy theories that are based on that idea of American exceptionalism.
I wanted to ask you also just about the election. You've been talking about and warning with all kinds of caveats about what we need to expect and what we need to be ready for and plan for on your podcast, which everybody should subscribe to and support on Patreon, the Muckrake podcast. Jared, how often do you do it? I can never figure out how, is it once a week, twice a week?
We're doing twice a week, and with bonus episodes, we're going to get up to about 3 times a week.
Awesome. So about the warnings for November, what do you see happening? I talked about this. Talk about this with my other guest today, David Litt, and I really wanted to get your take because you're so articulate on kind of the warning, saying it's not guaranteed, but we better prepare for this, and that.
Well, I love David. I can't wait to hear you guys talking. Actually, that just made me really excited. David's fantastic.
Yeah, oh, good.
Listen, I try really hard. I don't want to be a scaremonger.
Right.
I don't want to be an alarmist.
Right.
But what we have to understand is, and this is the thing that nobody really likes to talk about. I always tell people, it's like driving down the highway. When you drive for a couple hours, you kind of forget that you're driving.
Yeah.
Like you kind of forget that you're, flying down an interstate at 70 or 80 miles an hour. And then suddenly you wake up and you're like, oh yeah, that's right. There are consequences to actions, and this is really dangerous. It's the exact same way with social constructions. Politics, laws, constitutions, all of it, they're just made up. They're constructs that work as long as everybody plays by the rules and as long as you're able to enforce the rules that we've all agreed on. If you don't, they fall apart real fast. And by the way, the fact that we were talking about American exceptionalism, everyone thinks, oh, it couldn't happen here. It's America. America is immune to the idea of authoritarianism and fascism. It's not. We've had massive authoritarian fascistic movements in this country, and it's happened time and time and time again. We are prepped for this type of thing. Now, do I think that the election is going to get stolen or delayed or canceled? No, I don't think chances are that they will, but there is a chance. And people need to understand this, because it's not like Trump is in a dark room right now with a bunch of smoke coming up with plans. He is naturally, instinctually a fascist authoritarian. That is how he behaves. And he hates rules. He doesn't believe, and that's the other problem. He doesn't think he's the villain of this story, everyone. He thinks that he is the hero and he is the chosen Messiah type figure. And so as a result, if he loses an election, well, that election wasn't fair, right? So he's going to keep from being humiliated, to keep from being prosecuted, whatever. He's going to pull out all stops. And I was actually happy. I don't know if you saw it. There was a war game simulation that happened a couple of weeks ago. And it was a bunch of experts and politicians, and they actually shocked the hell out of themselves because they did it. And they were like, oh, my God, this ends all the time with the election either being stolen or blood in the streets.
Yeah, I read about that. Where was that? Well, there's a bunch of people former government officials gaming out the election, right?
Right. Yeah. And what they found was there more times than not, this thing ends in disaster. Because that's who he is. And here's the thing. When he talks about delaying the election, everyone's like, well, he can't do that. Well, authoritarians don't care what they can do and what they can't do. They do what they can do. You know what I mean? What they get allowed to do. And somebody like Trump perverts democratic institutions when people don't stop him. We've seen him engage in blatant corruption. We've seen him betray this country multiple times with no consequences whatsoever. So if you want to believe that all these things are going to pin him in, they're only going to pin him in if they're made to pin him in. So what I keep telling people, I would recommend voting early in the day if you can. Going out, getting your vote in, and being ready at all costs to be able to go out in the streets. Because I actually had a guy named Josh Berthum, a really smart guy on the podcast. And I think he's right. He said that a few of the most dangerous hours in American history are going to take place between when polls close and about 2 a.m. in the morning on election night. And a lot of things are going to get decided right then. And I think people need to be ready for some sort of mass action or some sort of danger, because I think we're staring down the barrel of a very long, very dangerous gun right now.
For instance, what happens between those hours?
It could be everything from internal exit polls telling Trump that he's losing. And then, and by the way, I don't know if you remember this, but it was like after he lost the popular vote, I think he lost like 3 million.
Yeah.
And immediately he's like, oh, I think there were 3 million illegal votes.
Yeah, he said it over and over.
Yeah. All of a sudden it was just like, oh, instantaneous math, right? So if he sees that he has lost and he declares that this election is invalid or wrong, I'm telling you, there are a lot of Trump supporters who believe that. And a lot of them have been primed and radicalized for violence. They've already shown it during the Black Lives Matter protest. And if they think that there's a coup, which a lot of them believe in these conspiracy theories, they probably think that it's either do or die and the country is going to fall into some sort of their own authoritarian conspiracy theory abyss. So people need to be ready for it.
I could keep talking to you for a couple more hours. I will let you go, and I hope people listen to the podcast, your podcast, and your YouTube. What do you call this when you just hang out and have a glass of, what is that, whiskey?
Yeah, every Sunday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, I drink a little too much bourbon, and I get sweaty in the Georgia heat, and, we talk about what's going on. It's called Bourbon Talk.
Well, Thursday night at 8 Eastern, I'd love to have you join me for my Zoom chat with listeners who I want to subscribe also to your podcast. If you're around, drop in. I'd like to have you then. But definitely check that out Sunday nights. Check out the podcast, and of course, go buy American Rule right now. I'm so glad to have you on the show and in my life, man. I love talking to you, and I think you're the best. Thank you very much, Jared.
Thanks, man. You were the best, and thanks for having me on.
Jared Yates Sexton is the political pundit that America needs. At JY Sexton, he is one of the sharpest people I talk to. And you know what I got to say? I talk to a lot of smart people on this podcast. Holy shit. I mean, these are some smart, thoughtful, articulate people who have thought through the issues that we're talking about, that have deeply researched and written about the issues that we're talking about. These are serious people. Oh, I'm very happy to be doing this podcast. Thank you so much for supporting me on it. And now it's time to bring on another awesome guest. This guy was a speechwriter for Barack Obama when he's like 24 years old. He ran, I think, the Washington Bureau of Funny or Die. He's funny as hell. He's smart as hell. He is a best-selling author. His first book was fantastic. It's about his time in the White House, and it was a bestseller. It was called Thanks, Obama, My Hopey, Changey White House Years. Oh, it's so good. That's when I met him, when he first came through SiriusXM. And his new book is even better. And it's super important. Every American really should read this book. Really should. It's so well written. It's funny. It's interesting. And it's important. It's called Democracy in One Book or Less: How It Works, Why It Doesn't, and Why Fixing It is Easier Than You Think. He's also on Twitter at David Litt. That's Litt. Tell him you heard him on the at Stand Up with Pete podcast. Follow that Twitter if you haven't, at Stand Up with Pete as well. Here now another thoughtful conversation about all the important ideas and issues surrounding our upcoming election, and a little preview on the conventions from former Obama speechwriter, best-selling author, the great David Litt. How do you deal generally with anxiety? Has that been a thing in your life? It's fairly new to me.
I have always had some levels of anxiety. I mean, I will actually say for me, when I think about like broad-based politics-related anxiety, which I've been having for my entire adult life, to me the only cure is to like do something, right? Like that's the number one reason that I say people, like get involved in politics, go volunteer in a campaign, whatever, is the odds that you are personally going to swing an election are small. They exist, but they're small. The odds that you're going to be able to feel a little bit like you can sleep at night because you don't wonder whether or not you're doing anything, those go up. So there's some real benefits to that. So
with like 90 some days left, let's start right there. What can people do? What should people do if they're stuck at home? I think the you can't knock on doors. Can you imagine just knocking on someone's door with a mask on? At this point, I don't think anybody wants you knocking on the door unless you're delivering a package that they just ordered. But
right.
I feel like you can do some kind of phone banking, which I've never done. What are your ideas or suggestions that people can do?
Yeah, absolutely. Phone banking. And I will say I am a bigger fan of phone banking than most. Like you end up talking to people and how often do you get an excuse to just talk to random people and get to know a little bit more? And I think the interesting thing about all that stuff is like, man, I am a much better writer for conversations that I had when I was volunteering and phone banking and back when you could knocking on doors, because you get windows into other people's lives. So I think that stuff is cool in addition to making a difference. And then there's always the basics, right? Like it's boring to say it, but campaigns need money, especially down ballot campaigns. So if you have, a lot of people are in a situation right now where that's not a possibility. But if you're one of the lucky ones and you do have a little bit of extra resources, thinking about the down ballot candidate who could use your support is a big deal.
And right now, I'd like to plug too, if you have any that you want to plug that come to mind. But Kim Mangone is taking on Kevin McCarthy in California. She's a Democrat. Kim Mangone, you can give her $5 or $10 or $1 million. I think that's actually illegal. And of course, our friend Mo Davis down in North Carolina, he is taking on some guy who is running because Mark Meadows left the seat to become President Trump's 17th chief of staff. Those are two down ballot. They're not that far down. They're House seats. You got any other candidates that you're watching, David?
I would look at the list of endorsements President Obama just put out. It had mostly Senate, House, people you would expect. But then there, Pennsylvania and Texas in particular, where there's some very competitive state legislative races and the chambers could flip. He endorsed a whole bunch of people. I don't know any of them personally, but that's kind of the point. They're down ballot candidates. The point of these races is you got to get to those majorities in those chambers in order to see progress made in the redistricting cycle. Who's going to draw the congressional districts for the next 10 years. So I would just Google President Obama endorsements. And that's, I think, a very helpful guide to like, what does a pretty smart guy think about when he can endorse just about anyone and have an impact? He only endorsed 10 state legislative candidates or so. Which 10 are those? And then how do you help out? And one last thing I would just say, if you're listening to this, I would also add pushing back on misinformation to the list of things that you can do personally, because there's so much out there that is completely not just untrue, but is intentionally untrue, designed to confuse people, designed to keep people from voting. And so, no one likes that person who's nasty on Facebook. But if you could be the respectful version of that person, and make it clear that like, hey, where'd you get this from? This doesn't seem accurate. And here's where you could actually find some real information that's helpful for people. It feels weird to do. But at the same time, like that is how elections are won right now, by people being slightly annoying on Facebook. So don't discount the value of that.
All good advice, especially on Facebook where older people tend to, I think, congregate. I know my mom is like always on Facebook, and luckily she's a very progressive woman. But a lot of people, there could be convincing being done. All good advice. Obama put out his list of endorsements today. One headline to come out of that was that he snubbed Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Do you think we should make anything of that, David Litt?
Well, I have to say, not super plugged into the Biden endorsement machine, so I can't speak with any kind of inside information. But no, of course not. I think if you look at the races where he endorsed, they were pretty much universally thinking about competitive races. This was a list of people where, he endorsed 118 people. That leaves out some number in the hundreds of thousands of people running for office who he did not endorse. It's not because he doesn't, support them, but it's because he's saying, hey, if you're going to pay attention to X number of races in the general election, these are the ones to pay attention to. I don't really think AOC is going to have any trouble winning her race for Congress. She's got that one handled, I think.
You have two really great pieces recently, one at CNN.com, one at the WashingtonPost.com, about the upcoming election and all of the things that we should be concerned by. I'll put the links to them in the show notes. I'll share them on social media because they're very, very good and informative with a lot of statistics and a lot of background, and I want to get into them. But before we get into your articles, going back to President Obama, last week, of course, he gave the eulogy for John Lewis, and during that speech, he made a lot of proposals that he supported, which I thought were pretty interesting, including making voting a national holiday, as well as a wide range. I can't list them all right now. Getting rid of the filibuster, which is really controversial if Democrats do take power. But what do you make of the proposals that he made and supported at I can't say John Lewis's eulogy. Sorry, sir. I apologize. What do you make of those?
So I have to say, I was so encouraged by that because I just wrote this book about democracy reform, right?
Such a good book. Everybody has to get it. I had you on to talk about that last time. And is it a bestseller yet, like your last book?
It is not a bestseller yet, but there's, after all of the people listening to this run out virtually and buy it, I'm sure it will be. So
Democracy in One Book or Less, How It Works, Why It Doesn't, and Why Fixing It Is Easier Than You Think. David Litt, go get it. There's a link to it in the show notes. Go ahead. What do you think of his proposals?
So I've been thinking about this stuff for a while, and the conclusion that I reached was that the single biggest overarching challenge that we face is that our representative democracy has been eroded away from us. And what President Obama was talking about in that beautiful speech, which was also and I can say this because, I used to write speeches for him, but I certainly had nothing to do with this one. So I get to just be like, hey, that was a great speech. And that was he could have just stopped by saying, here was John Lewis's life. Here was his march across the bridge. This was the moment when, it seemed like the other guys had won. We all knew what he was talking about. And he could have just stopped with the analogy, with the allegory. And instead, he went further, and he said it, and he talked about how, not just restoring the Voting Rights Act, but restoring democracy if we care about John Lewis and his legacy. And the thing that I would point out that is particularly important about that was the filibuster. The rest of it is very important, but
yeah, can you explain that, why it's important, and maybe a little bit of background? You write about this in your book. It's really important. And could you sex it up at all?
Let's see if we can sex up the filibuster. This seems
such
like a dangerous
ugly
game.
word. It should be a sexual position or something, some kind of sexual reference. But alas, it's just a parliamentary procedure. Am I even using the right words?
Well, you'll be interested to know that the first filibusterers were actually not lawmakers. They were pirates. So we will sex up the filibuster a little before you hear.
Yeah, there you go.
In the early 1800s, you had the flibustiers, who were the French filibusterers, and then you had the Spanish filibusteros, both very sexy languages. And
well
they created this term, the filibuster, to refer to people who were hijacking the legislative process, right? Like obstructing the process, taking it hostage, a la the flibustiers and the filibusteros, rather than participating in the legislative process. And today, the filibuster mostly refers to one specific thing in the Senate, which is that it takes 60 votes, 60 out of 100 senators, to basically pass any law. And that's a new development. It's what Mitch McConnell used to obstruct a lot of President Obama's agenda or just make life miserable for him as he was trying to pass it. And so the point that President Obama was making, and he was tying it back to, is the Senate filibuster was also used to block civil rights legislation when John Lewis was marching across that bridge. And in the decades before that. He may not have had to have marched across that bridge for voting rights had the filibuster not existed and had the legislative process been able to create a civil rights bill sooner. And so this puts a lot of pressure on not just Republicans, but on his fellow Democrats. Because right now, you have a lot of Democrats who are coming around to the idea that the filibuster, this thing that makes it possible for Mitch McConnell to obstruct anything, even if he loses elections, might not be a good idea. But President Obama was putting it specifically in the historical context of the broader fight to create a more perfect union, this broader fight against systemic racism. And that puts a lot of his fellow Democrats on the spot. You know, if they're going to continue to fight for the filibuster, they're going to have to defend this thing that really was, for most of the 20th century, associated with white supremacy, not with, you know, sort of institutionalism.
How is it associated with white supremacy?
So the way the filibuster worked for most of its 20th century history was that you needed 2/3 of the chamber to pass a law. So 1/3 could get together and stop any law. And the faction that had enough numbers and also cared enough about one issue was Southern Democrats, the racist Southern Democrats. So, for example, in 1919, they put forward an anti-lynching bill. The House passed this anti-lynching bill. It had majority support in the Senate, but the Southerners filibustered the bill, and the anti-lynching bill never passed. And in fact, 200 times they tried to pass anti-lynching bills, and the Senate filibuster killed all of those bills.
It's and a weird thing to be pro-lynching. I mean, it's murder, isn't it? Just murder.
Yeah, I mean, it's a horrible thing. Segregation and Jim Crow were horrible things.
It's like we're for murder. We can murder anybody we want. No, you can't. No society allows for vigilante clans to just get together and murder people.
Well, ours certainly did for a while, but that's and I think that was the one of the things. You go back and you read your history and you realize, like, I think I was lucky. I grew up in this time of saying, well, it could never happen here. But if you read your history, which I clearly did not do enough of as a kid, you're like, oh, it has happened here. Not as bad as in some other countries necessarily, not in all the identical ways, but this is fragile stuff. And to go back to the filibuster, the filibuster was a way of preserving that white power infrastructure in the South. And it's the reason that other senators didn't use it, because they said the filibuster is so associated with Jim Crow that in nearly every case they said, I don't want to touch that. I don't want to legitimize the filibuster by using it for my pet issue. And so actually, ironically, once the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act passed in 65, the filibuster became more common because it no longer became associated with segregation, because the segregationists lost their strength in numbers. They didn't have enough numbers to mount a filibuster, so other people started doing it. And the end result, fast forward a couple decades, is this current moment when even if Joe Biden wins in November, even if there's a big Senate majority, nothing will get done unless you end the filibuster. And by the way, that's all fingers crossed. I'm not counting on Joe Biden to win. I remember 2016, but even if he does, we got to think about that going forward.
What about making, as President Obama suggested, and many have suggested over the years, making Election Day, it's the one thing I could remember from the speech last week, making Election Day a national holiday. David Litt, when I think about Memorial Day and Veterans Day or President's Day to a lesser extent, nobody does anything. They're just happy to have a day off. I mean, you're supposed to celebrate or memorialize, focus on, you're supposed to do something. Martin Luther King Day, you're supposed to do public service. Nobody really does any of those things. We're all overworked. So we're just like, it's so good to have a day off. But it would be an interesting thing, wouldn't it be, to make Election Day a national holiday, and everybody would do something. You would know why that you had that day off, and it was simply to go vote. And it wouldn't take that much time if we took your advice in your most recent columns and a whole bunch of other pro-democracy folks that are writing and talking about this to make it easier to vote. What about that idea? Election Day, a national holiday.
I don't think it's a bad idea.
You're lukewarm.
I'm very lukewarm on it. So
wow.
I'm always very reluctant to disagree with something that President Obama said, because A, he used to be the president, B, he used to be my boss, and C, he's a lot smarter than I am. So it's quite possible I'm wrong here. But the thing about Election Day as a national holiday is you think about our other federal holidays. It's not that everyone gets the day off work. If you work retail, you often don't get, this is back when that was a thing, right? But like
retail,
let's assume that the pandemic eventually subsides and we have a more normal society again. If you're working for a multinational corporation and you're working retail, you may not get that day off anyway, just because it's a federal holiday. Whereas the white collar professionals who definitely would get that day off, they can already take time off to vote. Now, a couple of things you can do either in addition to a national holiday, because I don't think it's a bad idea. It just might not solve the problem you're trying to solve, or instead of a national holiday. One would be you could move Election Day to a weekend. There's nothing in the Constitution that says Election Day needs to be on a Tuesday. So you could have Election Day on Sunday, and then you could mandate all-day early voting on Saturday. So you could require states to allow early voting on Saturday, and you would basically turn Election Day into election weekend. And that would change. You talk about a sort of moment when everyone knows what we're all doing. You would be building toward election weekend. It would give people way more opportunities to go vote. Another thing you could do is, if you were aiming smaller, which I generally, I don't think we should do, but it's important to keep this stuff in mind. Most states, a lot of states, have laws in place that say if you leave work to vote, you have to be allowed to vote in order to, and your employer can't punish you. They can't dock your pay. They can't fire you. But there's two problems with those laws in a lot of states. Number one, it says, let's say 2 hours. You have 2 hours to get to the polling place and back. Well, sometimes we've seen these polling place lines go to like 4 hours or 5 hours.
Right.
So if you get stuck on that long line, then you say, well, now I have to choose between my job and my vote. That's a choice no one should have to make. And the other thing is usually the burden of proof is on the employee. So you need to prove that you tried to vote rather than just took some time off. And you need to so if you're living in a state with one of these laws, like an easy fix your state legislatures should make is tweak them so that, number one, you have as much time as you need. And number two, the burden of proof is not on the employees. It's a good faith system. And then you can audit it. And if it turns out everyone's taken 2 hours of vacation, you fix it. But the general rule here should be assume that people are trying to vote, because people do want to vote, and don't make it hard, right? Like every time we have these laws that say, well, here's another hoop you have to jump through. Yeah. Not surprisingly, that makes it a little bit more difficult to vote. And, you start to see turnout go down.
Things that are more challenging are always more challenging to people who have less resources, period. Less child care, less access to transportation, less money. So they have to worry about working and always fall disproportionately on folks like that. And those people vote, and their vote counts just as much as somebody who has full access to all resources. All right, I'm done opinionating or recapping what you just said. I do want to ask you also about, in your Washington Post piece, which is so good. I really enjoyed reading this. I read it twice. I highlighted things. I'm going to share it because you cover a lot of ground. It's super important here. It's titled, "Republicans Are Right. Election Fraud is Real. They are perpetrating it." You write, the real fraud occurring around the 2020 election is being committed by Trump and his allies, not through individual acts of malfeasance, but on a nationwide scale. This type of election fraud is not about adding fake voters. Rather, it's about subtracting real voters by using false claims of voter fraud to bar millions of eligible voters from the polls. That's such an important sense. It's not about adding fake voters, but subtracting real voters. And there's a number of ways that they're actively trying to do that, and that they've done this before. What are they?
If you look at this election in particular, right, you hear all of these claims, especially now that Trump is losing in the polls. He's starting to say, hey, the election's rigged. That's Trump speak for I think I might lose.
He said it last time, too. And then when he won, he just stopped talking about it.
Right, then he ignored it. But you started to see it get echoed by his allies, too. Like Bill Barr said, mail-in balloting, that's going to be a huge opportunity for fraud. Well, he had to give testimony in front of Congress. He's under oath. They said, Mr. Barr, you're the Attorney General. You're the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the United States. Do you have any evidence that mail-in voting could lead to more fraud? And he said, no. So why is it that someone like Bill Barr would make these claims without evidence? Because according to our legal structures, if you claim to be afraid of fraud, even if it's bullshit, I'm allowed to curse on this, right?
Yes.
Should I not have? I feel bad about myself now.
You probably destroyed a lot of lives right there.
Yeah, I'm so sorry to everybody. I just want to apologize. I said some things I shouldn't have said.
Okay, move the podium out of the way and keep going. But by the way, Bill Barr also said, well, it's something like, I just heard this quote today, it stands to reason that people would fraudulently vote. It's possible. Like he's creating this hypothetical attempt to cheat with no evidence. And it sounds, because when he talks, by the way, he sounds so reasonable.
I don't think that he sounds reasonable. What's interesting,
his voice, his delivery.
I don't think I've heard a Bill Barr impression before. That might have been my first. What I think you captured, though, is that he sounds so over it. It's really strange.
Yeah.
Like, he's like, I'm a 70-year-old man. I don't care about anything. But for some reason,
I did this job already.
But it's like if you're like, that's when people play golf. And instead he was like, I know, I'll destroy the country. Like that was his, like, I'm 70, again. I need a project for my golden years. And, but if you look at what he has said, right, he said it was common sense. Well, it's not actually common sense because there's all sorts of security for mail-in ballots. You can't just print a bunch of mail-in ballots like the president says you can. And if he had any common sense, he would know that's not the case. But, and by the way, if he had common sense, what he would do is Google it. He clearly never Googled the question because Google would tell you, yeah, this stuff is secure. But the reason that they're making all these claims is because if you make those claims, then the courts have said you're then allowed to pass laws, quote unquote, fighting fraud that are actually designed to keep people from voting. And that's the important thing, is that making up false claims of fraud, which is in and of itself a type of fraud, allows you to kick people out of the electorate. And so that goes back to what I was saying in that post piece, that, Bill Barr claims, he says, oh, I'm worried about people who are not eligible voters casting ballots. But that's not really what he's worried about. What he's really trying to do is make sure that eligible voters can't cast their ballots. And he's coming up with a fraudulent pretext to take people's voting rights away. So this is not just like another Trump conspiracy theory. And it's not just, like a bunch of nonsense from a guy who's addicted to Twitter. This is a deliberate strategy designed to make it harder for likely Democrats to vote. And we should be as outraged by that as, like we would be if it was not being done in a silly way on Twitter, but was being done in a nefarious way. Now, this is like movie villain stuff, and we should be angry about it.
There are any number of ways to protect the vote. Many states do this. Many countries do this. What's the difference between mail-in voting and absentee voting? It's the exact same thing, right?
Yeah, it's 100% the same thing. It's like I'm trying to like, you remember there was like that obnoxious kid on the bus. Maybe you had a different obnoxious kid on the school bus, but would be like, are you a Homo sapien or are you human? And you're like, I'm a human. And they're like, no, it's the same thing. Right? That was you. Yeah. You're that horrible person.
Yes. So,
mail-in voting and absentee voting are the same thing.
Yes.
I was the equally horrible person who was like deeply offended by this. It's like, well, anyway, so I'm glad we eventually met.
I threw your books out the bus window also because you were so smart and I was jealous and insecure and it's all I had.
I'm still working through it, but it's okay.
And you sat there and you took it, but you ended up in a really good place in life.
Yeah, it worked out. I think it's okay. But we both did, and this is a nice moment. But to go back to
they're the same thing, absentee voting. But I think the president and others, and I just realized this today. I really didn't realize they're the same thing. I thought it was something different, even though I wasn't worried about it, because if you could do one, you could do the other. But I think we're purposely being confused by the president and his tweets and others that this isn't something that we've done before, that a number of states do all the time, and people living abroad vote that way, and many other countries vote that way, and arguably it would be tougher to cheat or have a foreign interference on it, right?
Yeah. Let me explain what's really going on here, because I'm going to do something that I always hate when other people do, but I'm going to do it anyway, which is take something Trump said that has no basis in fact, and then be like, well, if he had a point, here's what his point would be.
I like that. That's okay, because he's always just like gradations off, but off in a way that's so completely wrong.
Yeah, sometimes what he has started saying now, because he's surprisingly on message about this stuff.
Well,
is even though his message is all lies, but he's consistent.
It's like the hoax, Russia hoax, over and over and over and over. And then, it's, I think Goebbels came up with this strategy. Keep repeating the lie.
Yeah. And it's something Trump is good at. And frankly, all politicians wish they were better at, right? Which is like Trump is immune to feeling ridiculous when he says the same thing 10 times in a row. Most people,
right.
If you
Law and order. What?
Right. If you'd be like, oh my God, I sound like such a moron. I just said that like 6 times and I just put it in and it doesn't mean anything.
No shame.
You would have that editor in your head and he has no editor in his head. And so that actually helps him in a weird way as a communicator, even though he's not a genius, very stable or otherwise. But the mail-in ballot piece here is sometimes he will talk about universal mail-in voting. That's clearly been what he's been told he needs to say. So absentee voting in a lot of states, you need some sort of reason for an absentee ballot. You can say, I'm homebound, or I'm not going to be, I'm on vacation. I'm just not going to be there, or I live overseas. What a lot of states are doing because of COVID is saying, no, we're going to send every registered voter an absentee ballot application, or in some cases, we will send them just like a ballot that they can fill out, or they can go vote in person. Some states are thinking about switching entirely to mail. I don't think any of them have done that. Every state is different. And what Trump is theoretically complaining about is the universal element. But even here, it's worth noting, 5 states already do universal mail-in voting. In Oregon, in Washington State, in Utah. And by the way, Utah, not a blue state. Can't find a redder state than Utah. You have universal mail-in voting, and it works fine. Everybody likes it.
Universal mail-in voting means everybody votes by mail?
Everybody votes by mail.
There are no polling places?
I'm like, are there no polling places? I don't know. I don't want to get fact checked here. But
we'll
I
look
will
it up.
say,
everybody should look it up. But
essentially not. Right now that can work different ways. So there's a lot of you can go to like a dedicated drop box and put your ballot in the mail so that it's like, you go to a place and you mail your ballot, but it's run through a separate system or whatever. And every state has a different system. But yeah, in Colorado, Oregon, Washington, Utah, and one other that I'm forgetting, they essentially all voting takes place through the mail. And that's if you talk to people from those states, including like Mitt Romney, who's from Utah, they're like, I don't see what's this? What are we fighting about? Right? Like, this is just how everybody's always voted. And then if you look at other states like Florida, where our president voted, even though he may have committed voter fraud when he did so, long story there. Florida does most of its voting through mail, right? Because it has a large senior citizen population. So they've embraced absentee voting. Even though it's not universal, they have a lot, I think it's 40% vote by mail. So what Trump is complaining about is not that something new is taking place. What he's complaining about is that he may lose, and he's trying to figure out some way after he loses to say, well, that didn't count. There should be a do-over, or I actually won.
Now, I've said this many times, so forgive me for being repetitive and on message, but I personally would wade through a river of COVID to vote on a voting machine made of COVID-19, David. But if I could easily vote by mail and not have to worry about my vote being thrown out or counted, then of course I would do that. The concern that I have that a lot of people share, but I feel is really maybe being undercovered, is the state of the United States Post Office. And in conjunction with the pandemic, it is needed now more than ever. And this is how we should vote. And it would be safe. It would be responsible for any number of reasons. But the handpicked Postmaster General, a Trump loyalist, is in charge. And they're having all kinds of problems at the post office right now. There may be no post office by Election Day. Maybe I'm being too hyperbolic. But what concerns do you have about the USPS, this great American institution that has a higher approval rating than any other federal agency, I think?
So my understanding at the moment is that despite all the problems in the post office is facing, and the fact that the Postmaster General is very Trumpy, they have guaranteed that they will deliver mail-in ballots on time. So if you're considering voting by mail and you think, should I even bother because Trump controls the post office? It's not. Basically, the short answer is yes, go vote. You should do that. And in some case, what you should do, by the way, is make sure you know all the rules around how to cast that vote, because the bigger concern is like mail that vote in early so that you don't need to worry about if it's going to be postmarked the day that you drop it in the mailbox or later. And make sure that that you seal your ballot the way you need to seal it. You can look this stuff up. It's not complicated, but that does cost some people their votes. You just have to be a little bit careful and double check. More broadly speaking, when it comes to the Postal Service and funding our elections, I hope that Democrats use the leverage they have right now, because Republicans cannot get their act together, and pass any sort of COVID relief. Republicans are trying to tank the economy in the middle of their own election campaigns, which hopefully they're going to wake up and realize that's a bad idea. When they do, they're going to need Democrats to help them get a bill through the Senate. And one of the prices, first of all, no, this should not be a partisan issue, but it is. One of the concessions that Democrats need to demand from Republicans is to say, we are not going to pass any kind of bill that's going to bail you out of your political troubles unless you agree to fully fund the elections so that we can have enough poll workers and lines are shorter, so that we can be sure that if you put a ballot in the mail, the post office will function the way the post office always does. All of those things that are absolutely necessary. The flip side of all of that is, if Republicans can't get their act together and decide to tank the economy in the middle of election year, we may lose some votes because the post office gets a little bit more chaotic, but Republicans are going to lose a lot more votes because they tanked the economy in the middle of an election. So I certainly hope they realize that even just from a pure Mitch McConnell political, don't care about people standpoint, they're doing this in a stupid way, and they should reverse course as soon as they can.
It's now our allotted time, but I really wanted to ask you about the conventions. You got a couple more minutes? You got to go.
Sure, yeah.
All right, so preview on the conventions. I attended the conventions, both the RNC and DNC, in 2000. I guess they must have been in 11 and 15 for the 2012 and 2016 elections. And I learned a ton. I had a lot of fun. I did a lot of networking and schmoozing. I interviewed a whole bunch of powerful, passionate folks. But what is happening now is nothing like that. Everything is going to be virtual. And so what can we expect out of these conventions? What are they supposed to achieve and accomplish? And what are the hopes that they can accomplish and achieve any of that outside of just effectually getting the nominee formally nominated?
So conventions, I think, are really two different things, especially in this current era where the nominee is decided going into the convention. Number one is what you described, right? The networking aspect. It's the same as, I assume, if you were a dentist and you went to a really big dentist convention, you meet other dentists, you talk about teeth or whatever dentists talk about, you learn stuff, and conventions are a way for people in the politics business or people who are amateurs in the politics business to interact, get to know people, think through different strategies and coalitions and all that. The other thing conventions are is a messaging event, a made-for-TV event for the American people, where traditionally each party has kind of gotten 4 uninterrupted days with a good chunk of prime time where the networks say, great, you can have our air and you get to do a little special and you get to present your case. Most of the time conventions, you see a bounce and then it fades. So it's not like switching to a virtual convention is going to fundamentally upend the race, I don't think. However, I do think you may see conventions get shorter, right? They may. I don't think you're going to see the same number of hours. I think people, right? And I think that may stick. People may end up saying, actually, the shorter convention's kind of nice. We didn't need to hear from everybody in that way.
Well, Biden has to take a nap every day at a certain point. Sleepy Joe has to.
Yes, you've just been possessed by the Team Trump Twitter.
No, I'm just ageist. I'm just ageist.
Okay, well, you have lots of good choices to be resentful of if you're an ageist voter in this election. You have lots of.
I thought you were going to say you have lots of good people to hear from to get us back on track in the conversation, because yes, we will hear from his VP candidate, who is probably going to be Kamala Harris, although who knows, could be surprised. I think Susan Rice and Tammy Duckworth are number 2 and 3, if you ask me, but we'll find out supposedly this week, if not definitely next week, right? But you will hear from a bunch of the other, quote, stars of the conventions or of the parties. I think in the Democrats category, it'll be, generally speaking, politicians and policymakers, maybe some Hollywood celebrities. And in the Republicans, it'll be like a couple Hollywood, quote, celebrities like Scott Baio and Antonio Sabato, and a bunch of like media people and very few politicians. I don't know, but how do they do these conventions in an effective way?
I think that I have high hopes. I know the people, or a lot of the people who are involved in the Democratic one. So I just, I'm like, all right, I trust these people. They'll figure it out. And I do think that you will see a convention that goes virtual, but thinks about it as, we're producing a TV thing, right? It's like, Stephen Sondheim's 90th birthday, right? Which got produced for Zoom instead of being a big live event.
Was it any good?
It was so good.
It really?
It was amazing. I have that has like 2 million views on YouTube.
Wow.
And I think I'm 1 million of them.
Well,
yeah. I'm also just a huge Sondheim person.
Well, but how do you get the energy? Because, as a comic and as a podcaster and all that, like it's sometimes hard to create energy that you absolutely have in a real life space, whether it be a comedy club, a jazz hall, or a convention hall.
I do think that's different, right? Like a traditional red meat speech where it's a live performance, that you're going to have to change that. I'm not writing any of those speeches, so I haven't given it a lot of thought about how they change, but I do think, I worked on the 2012 convention speechwriting team, and a lot of what we did was like come up with really fun applause lines. Well, there's not going to be the same opportunity for applause that there would be. So you have to come up with something different. But on the other hand, I think we've seen this work where, some formats maybe don't translate as well to Zoom, but a lot of them you can figure something out. And it basically becomes like, almost like the switch between like a multi-camera sitcom, right? Like a Friends or something, and a switch to a single camera, like a New Girl or a show like that, right? There's no laugh track, but you still so that the jokes change a little bit, but you can still land stuff. So this isn't jokes, but it's the same basic idea of like the format changes, so the tone changes a little bit, but you make it work. And I think they can. I think the really interesting question is going to be, can the Republican side, because they did the switch so late in the game, because Trump was trying to have this coronavirus party until he finally got talked out of it, are they going to be able to have a convention that looks, better than the Trump administration's COVID response? And that's a low bar, but the answer might be no.
There's always that question about campaigning versus governing. You can be better at campaigning than you can. Maybe it's easier to campaign than it is to govern. It's easier to put on a production like a convention than it is to pass a policy, convince people to vote. I mean, that's really what this is. It's a television production now more than ever. And I'm sure, the Trump campaign, I don't know, it just seems like since they've changed their campaign manager, they don't know what their strategy is. They're pulling commercials because they don't seem to have a strategy. They don't seem to manage stuff very well. And even if they did, he keeps changing personnel around. It's got to be a nightmare working on the RNC right now. Do you have any insight into it?
No, I would just say if you look at it, a lot of the best people in the Republican Party, a lot of the smartest people left the room. They left the building a while ago. Some of them because they have some shred of a conscience, and others because, basically they got pushed out by a bunch of kind of C-team players. That does not mean that Trump is going to lose. But I think it is there's been a brain drain on the Republican side. And what's interesting about it is you now have people who are really only focused, I think, and only good at speaking to the 40% of Americans who are diehard Trump supporters.
40%, you think?
I don't know if it's 40, but like he's currently at 40% approval. You have people who are thinking every day about how do we keep our people. I don't think you have a lot of people thinking about how do we get to 45 or 46 or 47 where we might actually win this race. They should
be saying, how do we keep our people alive?
Right. That would also be helpful, right? It's keeping frankly,
their voters.
Saying, yes, or keeping all Americans alive. Would
be
nice,
but I mean, seriously, like when you think of the states and you think of the age, I mean, it's not. I'm not joking. A lot of his voters are now being affected by COVID. Yes, it's disproportionately affected black and brown folks, poor folks. But that was earlier in the pandemic. Now you're seeing it. It's ravaged nursing homes, obviously, older people now in places like Florida. It's.
Yeah. Well, I think I remember having this conversation with a White House reporter in the first couple of months of the Trump administration. And it was while North Korea was resuming nuclear testing. And I remember saying, I genuinely think that as long as he knew that any nuke coming from North Korea was going to hit, a Seattle, San Francisco, LA, he wouldn't care because he'd say, that's great. Look at the electoral college math. That only helps us. And sadly, I think if the pandemic had hit red states first, they would have done more to stop it. And now it's out of their control.
Wasn't there some reporting that Jared Kushner, who was supposed to be in charge, looked at it affecting blue states? And like, I didn't read that reporting, but I don't know how accurate it was. But if that's the case, that's one of the most craven things I've ever heard. And it's not different than the analogy of the nuclear missile that you just, it's not different.
They just, they've always been
It's a worse death, by the way, COVID, than vaporization.
I can't speak to that with any.
I can. That's what this podcast is about.
Yes. The thing that I will say is, if you just look at it more broadly, right? Like from day one, they looked at COVID as a question of who do we blame, not as a question of how do we actually fight the virus. And so,
great point.
They've just, everything, like every bit of their strategy has been a blame strategy rather than a public health strategy, and it hasn't. Neither of them has worked, by the way. The public health has completely failed, but also they're getting blamed. So, it's we're living through a perfect case study in how not to manage a, existential crisis. And hopefully we continue to live through it.
David Litt, the way that you deliver and print and here on the air and podcast, radio, you're always hitting home runs. Everybody should buy your new book and read your articles. All those links are in the show notes. And I hope that we can talk again in a few more weeks as things progress. We'll probably have a VP candidate by then. I love talking to and learning from you. You're a great source for me and my audience. Thank you so much, pal.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. It was always fun.
There goes David Litt. Always great talking with him and Jared Yates Sexton. I hope you'll follow both of them. Say hello to them on Twitter. And I hope you'll join me on Thursday night at 8 at the subscriber only hangout. For the hangout link, you got to be a subscriber. Sign up now at patreon.com/Pete Dominick. And I'll see you hopefully in Pennsylvania this weekend at Royersford, Pennsylvania. Soul Joel's Comedy Club, outdoor comedy. Oh, I'm nervous and anxious about it already. The drive alone is intimidating. I don't want to leave my house, but I am excited to do stand up and hopefully see some listeners there as well. All right, and that is it. That's all I've got for you today. What else did I need to plug? I don't think anything. That's it. Thank you very much. I hope the hurricane doesn't do too much damage along the East Coast because we don't need any more problems. That's seemingly all we've got each and every day. But if you're struggling, I hope to hear from you. You can reach out to me always at standupwithpete@gmail.com. Thursday at 8, everybody. It's going to be a good one. And that's it. You're not alone. I'll talk to you. I love you. I'll talk to you tomorrow. I'm right here with you. I swear I am.